Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining today's NCCOR Connect and Explore webinar. My name is Todd Phillips, and I'm the director of the NCCOR Coordinating Center, and I'll be facilitating today's presentation. Our Connect and Explore webinars typically focus on a single topic or project, but today we're going to be showcasing a variety of NCCOR projects, tools, and resources from the past year. So thank you for joining us. Next slide. One more. And so for today's program, we're going to start with a quick overview of NCCOR for those of you who may not have been on our webinars before. And then we're going to have a chance to highlight some of our work in the areas of measurement, early childhood, and physical activity. We'll also be highlighting future areas of focus for NCCOR and where we're headed. Then we'll have a chance to answer your questions with a Q&A session with our panelists today. And then we'll wrap things up with a few announcements from NCCOR that you may be interested in. So let me introduce you to today's presenters. Happy to have Laura Kettle-Kahn, who is a senior scientist with the Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity at CDC. David Berrigan, who's a program director at the National Cancer Institute at NIH. Deborah Young-Hyman, who's a health scientist administrator with the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research, OBSSR, at NIH. Heather Devlin, a lead health scientist with the Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity at CDC. And last but not least, Andrew Bremer, who's the branch chief of the Pediatric Growth and Nutrition branch at the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, NICHD, at NIH. We're also happy to have, she won't be presenting, but will be available to answer any questions. Donna Johnson-Bailey from USDA will also be available today. So before we kick things off, if you need technical assistance, if you have questions for our speakers during the webinar, you can write them in using the Q&A feature. If you notice at the bottom toolbar, there is a Q&A icon with two dialog boxes. We're going to wait and answer all of the questions at the same time at the Q&A session, but throughout the webinar, you can enter your questions in that Q&A chat box. If you need technical assistance for some reason, please let us know using the chat box, which is the single dialogue icon at the bottom or top toolbar. Or if you're having any questions or trouble logging into the webinar, you can email us at ncor@fhi360.org, and we'll work with you to resolve the problem so you can attend. Also, we'll be live tweeting during the webinar. If you're on Twitter, we encourage you to join the conversation using the hashtag #ConnectExplore, and you can follow us at NCCOR on Twitter. To start things off, though, we'd like to open up with a couple of questions of you all. You can submit your answer directly on the screen by clicking the appropriate box. So let us know who you are. Select the option that best describes you or your role. We'll give you a few minutes to make your selections, and then we'll see the results. So there we have it. Over half of folks are public health professionals, 11% are researchers, 5% practitioners, and it's great to see so many students, 7% students, and then about a quarter of folks serving other roles. So our second and final question is, which of the following NCCOR tools and resources have you used? So we have our Measures Registry suite, including the Measures Registry itself and the learning guides, a guide to methods for assessing childhood obesity, advancing measurement white papers, our childhood obesity evidence base, our trail use research article, hot off the presses, or none of the above, that you're here to learn more about these. So we'll have our results in just a second. Wow, it's great to see so many folks have used childhood obesity evidence base, 18%, 10% with our guide to methods for assessing childhood obesity, and 5% on the MR measures registry. So great to see so many people have learned, have used our tools, and then even more who are going to learn about them today, and hopefully you'll hear about some resources that'll be useful for your work in childhood obesity. So thanks for taking these 2 polls. It's very helpful for us. So with that, I'm happy to turn our showcase over to Laura Kettle-Kahn, and she's going to give a quick overview of NCCOR for everyone. So Laura, over to you.
Thanks, Todd. Good afternoon, everyone. It's always a delight to be here with my NCCOR family and able to share all the good work that NCCOR is involved in. The first slide, what I want to do is for people who are unfamiliar with NCCOR, NCCOR launched in 2009, and its primary focus is on reducing childhood obesity in America. And we do this through efforts that have the potential to benefit children, teens, their families, and their communities in which they live. Next slide. The thing that I want to stress about NCCOR is it really, the heart of NCCOR is to try to accelerate what we do. And as individual partners, but more importantly, NCCOR allows us to work collaboratively and as a partnership, whereas we have found that we have so much greater impact, and just the cross thinking, the cross collaboration, it kind of pushes us, but it also synergizes where we land as a field. And so it's been highly productive over the last almost coming up on 11 years now. Next slide, please. NCCOR as a partnership brings together the 4 largest leading research funders in the United States: the CDC, NIH, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and USDA. We work in tandem to manage all sorts of different projects, but we try to reach common goals. We coordinate our funding to make the best use of all the available resources we have. We share insights and expertise that really strengthens the work that we do, and we hope strengthens the research that that results from these collaborations. Beyond the 4 funding partners, this is kind of the secret sauce in my mind of what NCCOR is, or how it works so effectively, is that we pull in the leading researchers and practitioners across the United States. We do this intentionally to ensure that our efforts can facilitate ongoing research that's currently happening in the field. It informs future research that we all think we need to engage in, and it meets the needs of a very diverse group of stakeholders that are implementing obesity prevention and control efforts on the ground. And bringing the practitioners into these conversations is one of the key ingredients into helping us do that. The next slide, please. NCCOR initially had 4 goals. We wanted to focus on the identification and design and evaluation of interventions, kind of obvious. Same with work on surveillance and improve it, increase the coverage, all the aspects of surveillance. And we have a long history there. We wanted to improve the capacity in the field for conducting research and evaluation, because obesity prevention is a very complex field. It is not straightforward, and it has grown tremendously over the last 10 years. And then finally, we wanted to be a national leader, as a group, to accelerate the implementation through communication and outreach of all the research knowledge that we were gaining. But more recently, we've added a fifth goal, and that is to work with non-traditional health partners to integrate their wisdom, their insight, and their knowledge into the obesity priorities that we're working on. And that has been extraordinarily fruitful. Sometimes it's a little difficult. We have to kind of get to know each other, but many of you are very, very aware of that. And it's almost become a norm in the field to do this. And NCCOR has led the way in that as well. Next slide, please. Finally, I just want to share what we're going to focus on today in terms of what we're going to share. There's a number of different projects that we're going to highlight, and we work in so many areas assessing childhood obesity that impact the built environment to make it easier to be physically active. We're going to be sharing highlights from a number of our 2020 projects in these areas, and I'm going to just read them. One is measurement. The next is early childhood. The third is physical activity. And then in the following slides that you'll see and throughout the following presentations, we're going to present each project and allow you to have some time afterwards to ask questions and get more information in detail. So at this point, I'm going to pass the baton to David Berrigan, and he's going to give us an overview of our projects related to measurement. Hope you enjoy it all. Take care.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Todd and Laura, for that cogent introduction to this webinar. And thanks to everyone for joining us. We feel really passionate about this public health challenge, and we're glad to see the strong interest in these NCCOR resources. So I'm going to share about two products that were released last year. The first is a decision tree to help investigators think about measurement in high-risk populations, notably whether a measure can be used as is, adapted for a new population, or if an entirely new measure needs to be developed for the population of interest. And the second is a guidebook to assessing childhood obesity. Next slide. So children and their families at high risk for obesity are often underrepresented in validation studies of measures, and therefore it's not clear how effective our research and evaluation is for those high risk populations. Culturally and linguistically appropriate instruments are critically important for that evaluation work. Fewer than 1 in 5 articles in the NCCOR Measures Registry were applied, adapted, or developed for high risk populations. And in 2019, 2020, NCCOR conducted a review of current articles in the Measures Registry. That paper by Foti et al. Is in PubMed, and hosted an expert panel and workshop to try to identify priorities and develop guidance related to measures development. A big shout out to members of the Johns Hopkins Evidence-Based Practice Center who carried out the review, and to Letitia Moore from CDC and Sonia Artiaga from NIH, and Amanda Scharfman from the NCCOR Coordinating Center, who really made this particular workshop happen. And of course, a bunch of other NCCOR members and Coordinating Center staff contributed. Next slide. One of the products that we're most excited about that arose from this workshop was a decision tree designed to guide users through some of the questions arising when considering measurement needs for the high-risk populations of interest. The entire tree is illustrated here. The interactive tree at the website guides you through a series of questions and points to relevant case studies and resources. Next slide. A closer look, for example, question 1 in the decision tree, where you start, Do you have a research question, and is it important to the community? That seems a little simplistic, I think, but very often we don't have a full answer to that issue of whether or not our work is important to the community. So if you answer no to that, you're guided to a case study concerning how to involve community members and stakeholders in your research and evaluation. So that seems like a critically important issue. Further on down the decision tree, you see questions about what you want to measure, whether the measure has been evaluated in a particular population, whether it has some unique characteristics that might lead you to try to work on measures adaptation further. Next slide. In particular, the decision tree points you to 5 case studies authored by noted researchers working in diverse populations across the United States. These case studies address involving the community, as I mentioned earlier, how to determine whether a population has unique characteristics that require measures adaptation. I think this is a particularly fascinating and difficult question because every population has some unique characteristics, but determining whether they're salient to the particular construct that you're trying to measure requires, careful thinking, and we believe consultation with the community. Third, how to adapt a measure for use in different populations, how to apply measures to use in different populations, and how to develop new measures for your research and evaluation project. So these case studies are not complete textbooks, but they point you to some of the primary considerations needed to address these questions. And they also point you to some of the other resources that NCCOR has developed to help enhance measurement. Next slide. Those resources can be found in the Measures Registry resource suite and include a searchable database of 1,400 validation studies of measures, a series of monograph-length user guides describing measurement issues for diet, physical activity, and the environments that influence them, some short-form videos for learning more about measurement. These are a fantastic resource to get a quick taste of what some of the primary issues are, and we really hope professors will use these for their classes as supplementary information. And the high risk for obesity decision tree I just described. So check out the resource suite and return to it often. Next slide. The second resource I want to just highlight without saying too much about is a guide for methods for assessing childhood obesity. The lead author of this guide was Dr. Dimna Gallagher from Columbia, and a real shout out to Dr. Vula Azganian from NIDDK and Dr. Brooke Belay from CDC for leading this project, along with an expert panel and further NCCOR members and staff. So the guide is intended to assist users in selecting the most appropriate method of measuring adiposity in children when conducting population-level research and/or evaluation on obesity. The measures span the range all the way from anthropometry to DEXA and methods in between in terms of feasibility, validity, and expense, among other variables. So hopefully this material will help people understand the considerations going into selecting measures of obesity and body composition. And we're excited. The link is the guide and link are getting a lot of hits. So I think there's a desire in the community for good, clear, authoritative resources about this kind of measurement. Next slide. And this is my last slide. So just looking ahead, the high-risk population workshop I mentioned earlier was a part of a series of 3 workshops on advancing measurement that we held in the past year or so. And we've now posted white papers arising from each of those workshops containing hundreds of research recommendations concerning individual behavioral measurement challenges, high-risk populations and communities, and environmental and policy influences on childhood obesity. So I commend those white papers to researchers at all stages of their careers. There's a lot of good project ideas in there. We do have a paper for a peer-reviewed journal submitted, that summarizes some of this material as well. So stay tuned for that. But the white papers are there and ready to read. Additionally, NCCOR members have started a new working group addressing measurement of diet in pre-K children, which seems particularly exciting because we know that obesity arises early in the life course, and events very early on can have long-lasting influences on childhood weight status. So check out these resources. Thanks for your attention. And now I'll pass the baton on to Todd and Dr. Deborah Young-Hyman for the next part of this webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And just a quick reminder, if you do have questions for any of our panelists, you can submit that question in the Q&A using the Q&A icon located below on the toolbar. And next up, we have Dr. Deborah Young-Hyman, who's going to give an overview of one of our early childhood projects. So Deborah, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm Deborah Young-Hyman from OBSSR at the NIH. I'm going to turn off my face so you can concentrate on what I'm saying and the slides rather than seeing a talking head, if that's okay with everybody. One of NCCOR's missions, as Laura mentioned earlier, is to promote successful and emerging interventions to prevent or reduce the rates of childhood obesity. One way to do that is to examine all the available evidence to identify what works with which children under what circumstances and disseminate this information to you, our stakeholders. NCCOR recently completed the Childhood Obesity Evidence-Based Project, which we fondly call COEB, which focused on early childhood obesity interventions for US children ages 2 to 5 years old, and we evaluated evidence spanning over 15 years. Next slide. So before I launch into this, this was a trans institutional working group with outside expert advice, and we marshaled all forces to better understand the kind of research that was going on in the intervention space to prevent or reduce rates of obesity. So what is COEB? COEB is a novel approach to include all possible evidence. Commonly accepted data aggregation methods, in other words, meta-analytic methods for clinical trials, restrict content and study type. Meta-analysis typically includes studies that meet very specific trial design and evaluation criteria, such as the Cochrane criteria, and conduct statistical evaluation of effect sizes of the packaged interventions with commonly defined outcomes. More importantly, they exclude many projects that produce evidence that cannot be included in this data aggregation method. The NCCOR COEB project is an example of a novel taxonomic approach to meta-analysis for social science evidence. And it took me at least 6 months to be able to say taxonomic fluidly. It classifies childhood obesity prevention interventions by characteristics such as study design, intended recipients, contextual elements, and intervention components. In other words, it unpacks the study intervention. This allows the exploration of the questions of what works best, in what context, with which intended recipients, the children. It produces adjunctive information to traditional meta-analytic methods, promoting intervention and policy development. We were able to demonstrate that using a taxonomic approach to social science evidence aggregation can make better use of all the available evidence from diverse obesity prevention studies and initiatives conducted in diverse settings and among diverse populations of children. Next slide. Here are the steps to this novel approach. The process of taxonomic meta-analysis starts with a scoping review of the relevant literature and develops a design hierarchy and a coding system of elements from all included reports, which produce foundational taxonomies and the database which will be used for analysis. Taxonomies in this example included the type of study or initiative, including ratings of the rigor and design, the subject or intended recipient characteristics, contextual and intervention elements, and evaluation schema and outcomes. This method is novel in that intervention components and outcomes do not have to be measured in exactly the same way, as long as the intervention component is designed to impact the same process and the outcome represents a quantified measure of the outcome of interest, which can be changed based on the question you're asking. The entire process is formally documented in this special issue, and it includes a manual of procedures for use of the resulting data set, so you can ask your own questions. Detailed steps for conducting the meta-regression are provided as well, so that this method can be replicated, which, as you all know, is something we're all interested in doing. Next slide. As I said, NCCOR published a special supplement in childhood obesity in September, which is available, including 4 papers that describe the rationale, the process and the analysis, as well as highlighting the findings from the project. There are also papers regarding its contribution to the field, both in childhood obesity prevention and meta-analysis. This is a new method and we hope to use it, replicate it again. And right now the NIH is considering another way to do so with a totally different social science topic. Below is the link to the special issue. I think that must be on the next slide. Is that on the next slide? Yep. Is the link to the special issue. You can read that at your leisure. And I am happy to take any questions about the project either today or by getting in touch with me at the NIH. Again, I want to shout out the working group and the multidisciplinary team that created this effort. And thanks for your time. Passing this on to physical activity.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for your interest in NCCOR and physical activity. I'm Heather Devlin, and I'm reporting on behalf of the work groups that you see listed here, with a special focus on the economic work. I'm especially excited to see the number of public health professionals and practitioners on the call today, and your interest in learning more about how NCCOR tools and products can support your work, because we'd especially like to hear from you about what would be most useful to you as we move into summarizing this economic work for practitioners and researchers. Next slide, please. With the economic work, NCCOR was responding to a need in that creating physical activity-friendly communities, in other words, places where people have the infrastructure such as sidewalks, bike lanes, and public transportation that connect their homes, schools, parks, and workplaces, is an evidence-based strategy to increase physical activity along with its many positive health benefits. And understanding the non-health benefits of these built environments improvements is needed because they play such an important role in building the rationale for these types of improvements. For example, safer pedestrian-friendly streets, mixed land use, and access to transit can be tied to economic benefits for communities. These are all features of physical activity-friendly communities that can be tied to economic benefits. But these are separate from the direct health benefits of physical activity. Next slide. There's limited research identifying the specific kinds of evidence that decision makers want and to support and inform their choices regarding improvements to a community's built environment that may promote more activity. It's also likely that what one community may need and prioritize as economically valuable may differ from another, and the metrics that'll be most informative for decision makers will also vary. NCCOR developed an approach for identifying and prioritizing potential key economic indicators to further a strategic research agenda and lead to the development of tools and guidance needed for collecting relevant data to inform future decisions on community investments for built environment approaches to improve physical activity. To support this effort, NCCOR began by hosting 5 discussion groups early in 2020 to lay the basis for later project activities by asking experts about their understanding of the economic rationale for built environment improvements and their experience with building this type of rationale. Using the information gathered from the discussion groups, NCCOR hosted a virtual panel of experts in June 2020. Over the course of the expert panel, the indicators were prioritized around 11 domains, such as housing, transportation, and others. And then following the expert panel, experts were asked to rate and prioritize the indicators on a scale of 1 to 5 around properties such as quality, feasibility, and influence. As a result of these activities, NCCOR identified 72 indicators, and listed here are the 10 most highly rated indicators, those receiving a score of 4.5 or higher on each of the 3 properties of quality, feasibility, and influence. Next slide. Looking ahead, NCCOR is working to disseminate the findings from these activities through multiple channels, such as a manuscript and a summary of findings for partners and key stakeholders that can inform research efforts and implementation of the economic impact of built environment approaches. The work group is also pursuing opportunities to evaluate these indicators in the field with support additional research. A follow-up conversation with experts is being planned, and the indicators that have been deemed to be highly feasible will be considered for monitoring efforts in CDC-funded states. Next slide. As you saw on the first slide, there is also work NCCOR is pursuing around physical activity projects related to trail use among underserved youth and active travel to school. Last October, NCCOR held a virtual workshop on active travel to school. The purpose of the workshop was to address key challenges related to measurement and surveillance of youth active travel to school and related environmental policy and program supports. The work group is currently developing a white paper that summarizes the key discussions from that work group and recommendations on metrics and indicators for active travel to school. NCCOR also recently published a review on trail use programs in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, and will soon release a program brief, and has released, as of today, just released a program brief on trail use for practitioners that's available on the NCCOR website. So check it out there. Thank you. Turning it over to the next speaker.
Awesome, and that's me. So thanks everyone. I want to echo my thanks to everyone who's tuning in today and joining us. It's really, one of the joys of being a part of this group is really interacting with our colleagues across all the sectors. So we are truly appreciative. And NCCOR, despite the craziness of our current times, we really are looking forward to opportunities in this year and moving forward. And continuing our efforts as well as expanding new efforts. And I want to underscore what my colleagues have said. We really treasure the input and the interactions that we have with stakeholders and our colleagues, because we're all here to move the needle and make an impact. Not surprisingly, one effort that we put a lot of time and energy into recently is focused on addressing the impact of COVID-19. on obesity prevention and control in the childhood space. And we are actively looking into many potential projects to address these impacts. As you all know, there are so many questions to ask and so many impacts of this pandemic on so many tangents of family life that influence obesity. That's something that we've taken to heart and have really taken a deep dive into. Another effort that we're focusing on is the role that social determinants play in obesity, and specifically one of our existing projects that's looking at community-based childhood health weight programs is considering looking more closely at telehealth interventions and how they can be evaluated remotely in this era of social distancing. And that's the impact of telehealth and the opportunities afforded by telehealth could be quite substantial. And so this group may also be exploring how an increase in these telehealth interventions might help improve the scale of these programs and understand how telehealth may eliminate some of the traditional barriers to participating in weight management programs, such as transportation. And so, yeah, okay. Is it my slide that's going back and forth? Okay. And then a third effort that we're focusing on is exploring the influence of early childhood and early childhood exposures on obesity. And this is something that has resonated with the group, really looking even before birth in the perinatal space. But specifically, one area that has risen to the top of importance is expanding our work in social determinants of health and early childhood interventions, particularly how they impact very young children in the 0 to 24-month range and their influences on obesity. And so, with that, we just highlighted 3 that our group has been chatting about and taking dives into. But we absolutely welcome any ideas that you all who are tuning in today may have in working in these spaces or other spaces, as well as other potential opportunities for collaboration. Again, one of the great joys of being a part of this platform is reaching out and engaging with stakeholders that have different lenses when it comes to looking at childhood obesity. But all the, it really is great that the sum is really more than just its individual parts. And so with that, I think I'll pass it back to Todd.
Yeah, thank you so much, Drew, and to all of our presenters. This is our chance to hear some of your questions and provide some of the answers that we have. We do have a few in the queue that we'll start with. Moses wrote, childhood obesity and obesity in general is becoming an issue of concern in Kenya. And so I would ask the panelists, what resources does NCCOR or your agencies, knowing that some of the NCCOR partner agencies have other initiatives related to international work, but what resources do we have that may be of interest to anyone on the call today from countries outside of the US?
I could
David,
take a stab at that, Moses. Thanks for your question and thanks for attending. I think I'd highlight 2 things. First of all, the educational resources of NCCOR related to measurement could be of interest for your research and evaluation efforts. So I especially commend the Measures Resource Suite with its monographs on measurement and its video tools. And then I would also point you at NIH to the Fogarty International Center, which has been beginning to develop a series of workshops and resources related to childhood obesity, so far concentrating on Latin America. But I believe that all low and middle income countries all over the world are of interest because this is a pressing global health problem. So I'll paste a link into the chat box there and stop at that point.
Great, thank you, David. Any other comments anyone would like to add? Yeah, I would just add, go ahead.
It's Deborah. I wanted to clarify for our audience whether NCCOR as a whole is focused on the US population. And I think you probably are best to answer that.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I was just going to add that NCCOR as a organization and collaborative is focused on childhood obesity in the US. We do have many tools, as David mentioned, that may be relevant, around measurement, around physical activity. The compendium, especially, we know is useful throughout the world. So I would say check out ncor.org and look at our resources. And as always, feel free to be in touch with us at ncor@fhi360.org, and we'll try to connect you with any other resources we're aware of as well. So one other question, thanks Moses for asking that, from Carol is with regard to physical activity, were issues relevant to remote communities included as rural areas have fewer of the items noted? So Heather, I'll throw that over to you.
Thank you for that question, and it is an important one. I'll first say that in the evidence-based recommendation that I mentioned, evidence for rural areas was noted or is noted as a gap, and it's an area that we're always looking to build additional evidence in. However, we do have a lot of good examples of the basic idea of connecting, the way we describe it, connecting activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. In other words, making connections between transportation and land use in a way that suits the context. We have examples of that from all types and sizes of communities, and that is a primary interest of the work group around the economic indicators, is to choose indicators that communities of all sizes and types can adapt and use effectively. We are also working with our CDC-funded recipients who also work in predominantly rural, or at least half of them are working in rural areas, and we are learning from them about what works better in those areas. As we test out and gain information about which of these indicators may serve those communities best, that will be integrated into the work or the products that come out of the economic work group. Last but not least, I'd like to put in a plug for a few resources that have relevance for rural communities around these built environment improvements on the CDC website, and I can put a link to those in the chat.
Awesome, thank you so much, Heather. Next up, we have a question from Patricia. Are there any positive trends that you see where there's been some sort of effective intervention? And I'll ask that Deborah answer that question.
Oops. First of all, I'm so glad somebody asked that question, because the answer is yes. We do see trends. So I just want to frame my answer by saying that in this particular instance, the analysis we did was, the outcome was change in BMI, reduction in BMI. And so that limited the reports that we could include, although there were over a total of there were thousands originally, but ultimately it limited the number that we could include in the analysis. But here's the good news. The good news is that in 2 to 5-year-old children, interventions that are both delivered by healthcare workers in healthcare settings definitely trend to be more successful in reducing increased rates of BMI, meaning it actually reduces the number of children who are in the obese range and also reduces their weight increase. So that's number one. And number two, that helping parents to understand reduced screen time, even in these very young children, which is a replication of the findings in older children, was also found to be a significant contributor to reduction in rates of obesity. That is an intervention that can be provided by numerous people. It is one that is family-based, and parents can be helped with what we would call behavior change strategies, and that seems to be successful. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Deborah. NCCOR did have one project that focused specifically on areas of childhood obesity declines and published some papers there. So we'll put a link in our chat to the NCCOR section of the NCCOR website that includes those papers about where we've seen some declines in the US and what led to those declines as well.
Yes, and to follow on that, just to say, and this is again, in some ways, the replication of other major studies. What we know pretty robustly is that you need multi-level, multi-focused, multi-pronged approaches to prevention of childhood obesity. It takes a village.
Just scrolling through the number of questions. We do just have time for a couple more, but I want to let folks know we're recording all of your questions. And if we don't get to it today, we will answer the question and be in touch with you. Patricia also had a question about what are the current statistics for childhood obesity. David, did you want to mention that? It looked like you said you were typing an answer, but in general, CDC is the agency that collects that information. So we can include a link of the site on CDC that provides the childhood obesity statistics for the US.
Absolutely. That's all I was going to say, is that CDC is our best source for the most rigorous and up-to-date data on the prevalence of various health conditions and including obesity.
Great. All right, one last question from Cassidy. Do you have research or resources on early childhood hunger and obesity? As a dietitian, this is of great concern. Donna Johnson-Bailey, I'm not sure if you're on from USDA, if you're able to mention that. I know this is a area of great concern for USDA.
Hello, everyone. I would recommend that you visit the Food and Nutrition Service website, the research pages. We have conducted a number of studies on the WIC population in particular. This does not necessarily apply to the general population, but it does apply to the WIC population, and it is a significant subset. We have a WIC infant toddler feeding practices study that does give information on the health status of those who are enrolled in WIC. So that would be the population from birth to 5 years. And so I would encourage you, and I can certainly add a link to this chat and the NCCOR resources that would link you to that information and provide some insights there. We also have some information for our child nutrition programs, the child and adult care food program, and I can add those as well. But please visit the FNS research pages for additional information.
Great, thank you so much, Donna. With that, we'll wrap up our Q&A session, but I do just want to reiterate, we're capturing all of the questions and we'll be in touch via email to help answer the questions that everyone has asked. So thank you so much for your engagement and asking questions of our panelists. We really appreciate it. So just to wrap up, a few announcements from NCCOR that you may be interested in. We do have a couple of upcoming events. The first one is our next Connect and Explore webinar, and this is a deeper dive into the project that Deborah gave us an overview of. So on the childhood obesity evidence base, using NCCOR's newest data set to examine childhood obesity interventions. So if you'd like to learn even more about that project, please join us on Wednesday, March 24th at 2 o'clock. And I'll be sharing the page later where you can register for this webinar. The next one we have is a partnership with American Trails, and NCCOR is joining an American Trails webinar to talk about our trail use paper. So presentation on effective programs to improve access to and use of trails for youth from under-resourced communities. That webinar will be on Thursday, April 22nd from 1 to 2:30 Eastern Time. And if you look in the chat, we're providing the links, appropriate links in the chat box for these webinars. So just a couple of further announcements. If you're newer to NCCOR and learning about us, please sign up for our e-newsletter. We send it out each month. It includes everything, the latest science around childhood obesity, about upcoming events. And most importantly, for many people, we actually compile all of the funding opportunities related to childhood obesity research to give you a heads up on what's coming to help fund initiatives and research that you may be interested in from our 4 partners. And you may not know that NCCOR also has a student hub. This is part of our website that's designed specifically for college and graduate and PhD students, where we show how NCCOR tools and resources can be helpful in your studies and the research that you may be conducting. So please go to ncor.org/e-newsletter, and you can sign up for our NCCOR Student Hub newsletter that goes out about our resources and opportunities. And then please visit our Student Hub webpage. We'll put the link in the chat as well, but this is where you can find resources for students in the work that you may be doing related to childhood obesity, nutrition, and physical activity. Also, if anyone has used any of our NCCOR tools or resources or reviewed our materials, we'd love to hear about it. We like to feature folks who have used our tools on webinars, so you can send us an email at ncor@fhi360.org, and you may end up being featured on one of our next webinars about how our tools have been useful to you. So any further questions? It seemed like we had a lot of folks who may be your first introduction to webinar or to NCCOR. So for any further questions related to what you heard today or other questions about NCCOR in general, please feel free to email the NCCOR Coordinating Center at ncor@fhi360.org. And we're happy to answer your questions and connect you to any resources and tools and materials that we think can help you in your efforts. And then this webinar and all of our other Connect and Explore webinars are placed on our Connect and Explore website. That's where you can share any of our webinars with your colleagues, and it's also where we list the schedule of upcoming webinars. So check out this page. And lastly, just a big thank you to everyone for making time today to join this webinar. This was our first NCCOR showcase where we're highlighting a range of projects from the past year. So a big thank you to our presenters and a big thank you for everyone who took the time to join today. Thank you again and have a great afternoon.
Thanks to everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you all.
Thank you.